I'm sure you will be enjoying the festival of knowledge that lies ahead of you for the next 2 weeks. Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. It is my pleasure today, this afternoon, to introduce to you Michael Barbour, who has lectured at summer school before. Mr. Barbour hails from Zimbabwe and Zambia, I believe. He studied at the University of Natal, Pietermaritzburg, where he read a degree in economic history. He then worked for the National Archives of Zimbabwe, then known as Rhodesia. He also worked as a librarian in South Africa, in East London and Durban. In 1986, he decided to move to Italy, where he studied art history at the British Institute of Florence. From the early 90s, he lectured regularly at the University of Natal Unit for Continuing Education, as well as the University of Cape Town Summer School, all on subjects related to the visual arts of the 13th and 15th century in central Italy. His studies in Florence and his work for many years as an organizer and guide for private tours to the art sites of that region gave him a sound knowledge of the art of places such as Florence and Assisi, and he also developed a very particular interest in iconography as well as fresco styles. Michael, let's welcome.
It's going to be most effective about. I don't know how the ranges work. And that I can put in my pocket. Yes. Is the volume right for everybody? Good. We'll try and get through this without any explosions, even though I'm not using a Samsung Galaxy. Firstly, thanks to you all for being here and welcome. I hope that we're going to have, from your point of view, quite an exciting time this week, hearing about a really extraordinary family that went on and on and on in all sorts of directions. Before I talk about the origins of the Medici, however, I have a couple of background things to say and things that are remarks and diversions about practical matters. First thing is that I welcome questions and I welcome comments and inquiries from you. And that's the reason my email is up there, because if you have anything to say or to ask, please either send me an email or give me a written inquiry after the lecture or before the next lecture, or come down and speak to me personally, so that we can all share your interest. Then, there are a couple of problems, in a sense, of historiography and of dealing with such a subject. The Medici Archives are vast and extraordinarily complete. They contain millions of documents. For the period of Cosimo il Vecchio's life, for example, he was born just before 1400 and he died in 1464. So he was about 68 or 69. For that period alone, there are some 30,000 letters. The published letters of Lorenzo the Magnificent, his grandson, run to 16 volumes last time I checked. They haven't got to the end. These then are the archives of the earlier generations of the Medici. Then there are the archives of the Grand Dukes, the so-called Medici del Principato. This has survived virtually intact, offering the most complete record of any princely regime of the period. This collection comprises more than 65,000 volumes. Sorry, 6,500 volumes, but containing about 4 million letters. The first written in 1537, around while Michelangelo was working on the Last Judgment. And the last missive arrived at about the time that the last Medici disappeared. So we should know everything about them fairly accurately. But no, we don't. The problem lies sometimes with the secondary sources, sometimes else with what I will call circumstantial presumptions. There are often commentators of the day or contemporary writers of accounts of events, sometimes witnessed, sometimes heard secondhand, and what those sources recount is not necessarily something that would be written down by the Medici themselves or registered in official documents. I give you an example. When did Duke Francesco first meet the notorious Bianca Capello, who became his second wife? There are different accounts in contemporary chronicles, and of course, since their initial liaison was clandestine, it's not something recorded in official documents, or, as far as I know, in personal letters of the Medici. So secondary sources take up one or another of the versions. Either he saw her in Santa Croce, or he saw her in the market, and so forth. An example of circumstantial presumption is discovering a painting in a Medici residence, for example, knowing the date of the painting, and then presuming that it was commissioned by whichever Medici lived in that residence at the time. This is very much the case with the most famous Botticellis, for example. Whereas, after this circumstantial presumption has been repeated so many times and has become a presumed truth, a document might come to light showing some other provenance, that the work, in fact, had got there by a different route. And this repetition over the ages, a circumstantial presumption, may also lead to what is called a foundation myth, where, for example, a misinterpreted remark or a comment may become so widespread that it is eventually taken to be a truth when there is no foundation evidence. The greatest example in Italian art history of this is the myth that Giotto painted at Assisi. Another caveat regards dates. Dates depend on three things: that in Medician Florence, the day began at sunset. The year began on the 25th of March. And the Gregorian calendar adjusted the number of days in the months and years. The Florentine calendar was used in Italy in the Middle Ages. In this system, the new day begins at sunset. When the reference of a birth was, for example, 2 hours into the day, this meant 2 hours after sunset. Hence, if you were born on 10 o'clock in the evening on August the 12th, 1449, your birthday would be, by modern reckoning, August the 11th. And you can imagine that this causes some discrepancy in all the history that has been written since the 18th century, when they were less aware of these fine points. The birth date for Lorenzo de' Medici, for example, Lorenzo the Great, the Magnificent, he was born on the 1st of January, 1449. Well, in the old histories, it's always told as 1448, because yes, it was 1448 when he was born, but not anymore. Furthermore, until 1721, the year began not on January the 1st, but on March the 25th, which is why some dates, like Lorenzo's, have this discrepancy. Now, in case you're thinking those crazy Italians, let me tell you that Italy was one of the first of few nations to convert immediately from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. October the 4th, 1582, was followed by October the 15th, 1582. At least they stuck to the same year. Imagine how extraordinary that is. No one at all was born in Italy between the 5th and the 14th of October, 1582. Nor, of course, did anybody have a birthday party, and nor did they save any money on such a birthday party. They were cheated out of a birthday that year, and one writer tells us that there were riots of discontented, indignant mobs demanding back the 10 days that had been robbed from their lives. And while we're on the subject, I know this is a diversion, the British Empire, in the British Empire, Wednesday, the 2nd of September, 1752, was followed by Thursday, the 14th of September, 1752. In France, the year began on Easter Day, so it was movable, until 1564. The Venetian year began on March the 1st until 1552. And the English year began on March the 25th until 1752. In England, it was known as Lady Day. March the 25th, of course, is the day of the Annunciation, so it's a perfectly reasonable day, the day of the conception of Christ, a reasonable day to be the beginning of the year in a Christian country. What used to surprise me was that a sensible country like England did not adopt the Gregorian calendar in line with Europe until the 18th century, almost 2 centuries after Italy. As I say, it used to surprise me, then came Brexit, and it doesn't surprise me anymore. To end this line of thought, in October 2016, just 3 months ago, Saudi Arabia changed to the Gregorian calendar. Better late than never. A further background point is about values and money, because I'm always irritated when I read about something and I'm told, for example, that Cosimo spent 60,000 florins on something. Because what on earth was 60,000 florins? It means nothing unless one has a relevant measure in terms of a relative value. The florin was the Florentine unit of currency, the ducat was the Venetian, but they were almost equal value, containing 3.5 grams of gold apiece. In the 15th century Florence, a skilled worker, not worked, he might not have worked at all, but he was a worker, or a teacher, earned about 100 florins a year. 3.5 grams of gold today is about 25 euro, therefore he earned 2,500 euro a year. Just as a matter of interest, current salaries in Europe from 2,700 euro a year in Bulgaria to 37,000 in Denmark. So a teacher in Bulgaria earns about the same as a teacher in 15th century Italy. Furthermore, Galileo, when he was appointed a professor of mathematics at Pisa in the 1580s, his salary was 50 florins a year, and he was most indignant about it. I should think so. 50 florins a year. But is this a valid way of looking at values? I just want to mention that another way to look at such values is, of course, the purchasing power. And the problem there is that the florin was a gold coin and used for transactions of fairly high amounts. Baser silver coins were used for everyday purchases, so I can't tell you how much a beer or a lettuce cost in those days relative to the other values. The final piece of practical information I want to tell you is that the electoral basis of the government in Florence, in the period we're talking about, the electoral basis was the guilds. Okay, the guilds of the arts. They're called in Italian the arte, A-R-T-E. The guilds represented all the economic productive activities of the city, and the members of each guild elected a representative called a prior, who in his turn represented his community, so to speak, in the government's legislative process within the city. It stands to reason then, and this is a fairly important point, that if the economic activity in which you are employed has a major client who is part of the Medici Empire, your interests will coincide with his. And that's a fundamental point, really, in how the Medici in the early days obtained their power without actually holding any office. Tomorrow we'll see more of the hierarchy of the government of Florence. But so let's begin with the Medici themselves. Can I have a little less light? Perseus, it seems, is an unlikely place to start. If, like me, you never remember who was who and who did what in Greek mythology, may I remind you that Perseus was the son of Zeus, who we all know was the boss god, and Perseus's mother was Danae, the daughter of the king of Argos, who consulted the oracle at Delphi, because he wanted a son, not a daughter. He was upset to have a daughter, not a son, so he asked what he should do. I'll skip all the silly bits like bronze chamber and the sunshine and all the rest of it, and remind you that the important thing is that Perseus was a legendary founder of the city of Mycenae and of the Perseid dynasty. And in the 2nd millennium BC, Mycenae was one of the major centers of Greek civilization. Perseus was one of the greatest Greek heroes and a slayer of monsters, and he beheaded the Gorgon Medusa. What has all this to do with the Medici? Well, Mycenae, a major center of civilization, equals Florence. Founding a dynasty, the Medici. Slaying the monster, Medici triumph over republicans. This is what says the old Encyclopedia Britannica. Some court historians, indeed, declare the family to have been founded by Perseus, and assert that Benvenuto Cellini's bronze Perseus, holding on high the head of Medusa, was executed to symbolize the victory of the Medici over the Republic. I do not know when this silly idea was first propounded, but painters of the 16th century, let me remind you, were very keen on painting the apotheoses of dynastic patrons. The head of any kind of dynasty or family that had achieved any kind of power, painted on their ceilings the head of the family in a chariot pretending to be the sun or whatever else. Let us, however, turn from the adventurous, genealogical, romantic myths to the tangible evidence, which I'm afraid puts the origin of the family much more recently and quite unrelated to Greek gods. We'll return to Perseus in the context of the statue's commission. The tangible evidence, on the other hand, is the record book, which first mentions Medici properties in 1201. Various Medici names are among the ruling council and finances in about 1240. Then, in 1291, a certain Ardingo de' Medici held a public office and became the gonfalonier of justice. The gonfalonier was the kind of president of the council, the mayor of the town, in effect. It's not certain, however, whether he was of the line of the Medici who ruled Florence through the 15th century. In fact, there are earlier mentions of Medicis going back almost to 1100, but there is no direct connection that we know of so far. The line that was to rule Florence, the first note we have, is of Giovanni di Alverardo, also known as Giovanni di Medici, the first on the family tree that you have as a handout. And he was the father of Cosimo il Vecchio, the most beloved. Not handsome, but rich. Of Giovanni de' Medici's achievements, we know that he was one of the richest bankers in Italy when he turned to public life in 1400. Already in 1402 and 1406, he was appointed prior of his guild. That was the guild of the money changers, called the Arto di Cambio, wherein his family had first been registered, it seems, in about 1348. In 1421, he was appointed Gonfalonier of Justice, like his presumed ancestor a century and a half earlier. As you see from the family tree, the same one on your handout, he's the common ancestor of the two branches of the dynasty. He is right up at the top there, and he had two sons. This one here is Cosimo il Vecchio, okay? And Cosimo il Vecchio is going to be, as I say here, the father of the fatherland, and produces Lorenzo Magnifico. I better stick either to Italian or English, but you're not going to hear both of them. Lorenzo the Magnificent, and right down to Alessandro, whereas this branch of the family, from Cosimo's brother Lorenzo, doesn't arrive in power, so to speak, until Cosimo here. Here, nobody is left. So the power transfers over here to Cosimo, the first Grand Duke, and that's the rest of the line until the last one dies in 1743. For the time being, however, we look only at the principal line, branch of the family. Before meeting the Grand Dukes on Thursday, the political power bosses running Florence are these on this side. And each of these, before the Grand Dukes, have their own brand of patronage and special interest. So we start with Giovanni, right up there. Whoops. Giovanni, up at the top, who died, as you see, in 1429, followed by Cosimo il Vecchio, the greatest, perhaps, of all this branch of the family. And I've given you a bit of an impression here on this table of how he fits into what was happening at the time. The Great Council of Florence, an extremely important historical moment in the history of Italy, the history of the Roman Church as well. And sculpture of Donatello. In his time, the Duomo was completed, although, of course, it was not directly an act of Medici patronage. His son Piero was short-lived, so to speak, and then we have Lorenzo il Magnifico, the most popular in a sense, whose son was a bit of a washout, and a significant, perhaps, event in his lifetime was Michelangelo's David. Sorry, MA is Michelangelo. Michelangelo's David. But that was not either part of any Medici patronage. Quite the opposite. It was a Republican commission. He's followed by Cardinal Giovanni, who's hardly worth mentioning as leader of the family, but became the Pope Leo X, very important pope. and one of the greatest patrons of the family, even though not directly in the way that we usually talk of patronage at this period, i.e. painting, sculpture, and architecture, but he in terms of books and music. Then his cousin, Cardinal Giulio, who again became a pope, Clement VII, followed then by, you see how confusing the Medicis can get, followed by Lorenzo de Piero, whose father was Piero de Lorenzo. Those last two were part of the whole gang of Medicis who were illegitimate. Anyway, we'll come to that. With Giovanni de' Bici, right there at the top, we see the first acts of patronage of the Medici dynasty, which had two separate aspects. First of all, this is the patronage of the cultural life of the city. And it's appropriate to say here something about this kind of patronage, that there were these two aspects, the private and the public. And it was the public aspect that was obviously more important to the procurement and maintenance of power in the generations before the Grand Dukes. Patronage meant both financial support for public projects and playing an important role in securing or promoting public authority for public projects. In other words, by acting within a public office, or in their case, even without public office, as an influential promoter or even opponent of a public project. Now, a very good example, I say opponent because a very good example is Lorenzo il Magnifico and the Duomo facade. The completion of the Duomo facade in Florence had been a project in the back of the minds of the people for a very long time, and twice during Lorenzo the Magnifico's period of hegemony in the city, there were competitions for a design. And certainly in the year before he died, he actually blocked what was proposed, thereby also exercising a kind of cultural power, but also, thank goodness, saving us from something quite horrendous. We'll come to that, in fact, tomorrow. In the celebrated competition for the now north doors of the baptistry in Florence, there was a competition in 1401. Giovanni de' Bici was on the commission that judged the entries. The two most famous entries are the panels of Ghiberti and the panel of Brunelleschi. These are wonderful things. I hope many of you have seen them. It was perhaps the first international public art competition at this kind of level. Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. I'm tempted to ask you which is which, just for fun, but I'll tell you instead. The one on the left is Brunelleschi. The one on the right is Ghiberti, and it was Ghiberti who won. But it was important that Giovanni de' Bici was on the commission, and therefore we already have an inkling of the Medici as, in a sense, connoisseurs of art. It's also since he was gonfalonier of the city at that time, almost certainly an important part of his decision. At least his decision was an important part of the result. And we also know that he made a very good financial contribution through the guild, probably, to promote the competition. He was also, as gonfalonier, involved in the city's decision to promote the Ospedale degli Innocenti. And in this case, he openly supported its building financially. The Ospedale building was commissioned from Brunelleschi in 1419 by the Arte della Seta, that's the Silk Workers Guild. It was one of the richest guilds, and it took upon itself, like almost all of them, all the guilds, to do some philanthropic activities. The Ospedale was a refuge for abandoned babies, and subsequently, over the centuries, the charitable and welfare institution for children developed there, and later also for mothers. It took many years for the building to be completed and was formally opened only in 1445. That's 26 years after the commission. Near the end of the century, in 1490, the charming rondels by which the building is really finished off, shall we say, were added by Andrea della Robbia and put into spaces which, interestingly, Brunelleschi had designed and intended to be left empty concavities. In the middle of the next century, it was sustained by the Grand Duke Cosimo himself, who appointed a Benedictine manager of the institution. It's one of Cosimo, the first Grand Duke, one of his many, many, many activities of patronage and actual governance of the city. His energy was just incredible, but we talk about him on Wednesday. It continues as an updated version of the original community welfare organization, and the Ospedale is of such international renown that it also nowadays houses the research division of UNICEF. Within the last months, after about 12 million euro spent, it has also become one of the latest museums. Now let's see if we can. How are we going to start that? How do we start that?
Is it the hyperlink?
There should be a thing down there. No? I'm sorry, you're not going to see what the new museum is like, but you'll be able to watch it on YouTube at home. It's the latest museum in Florence, the Museum of Childhood. And as with museology these days, it is absolutely superb. And I show you that, at least I wanted to show you that, to illustrate that the threads of the Medici heritage are long and countless. We'll see other examples. They reach us today in almost every corner of Florence. Not just the big attractions, like the paintings of Botticelli or the statues of Giambologna, universally known and associated with the Medici label, but just as their written records of their history are so vast, so too are the material records of their power and patronage of the city. The private face of Giovanni de' Medici's patronage was his commissioning of frescoes and furnishings, which we're told, for his home, but we lack details there. And, of course, none of it exists anymore. He established a pattern here which was to continue into the next 2 generations of his family and would resurface also in the age of the Grand Dukes. That is, to commission works privately that would have a public place, but a very personal reference or a private relevance. Most commonly, this kind of patronage was, of course, in chapels and works of art for churches. Case in point is this magnificent tomb of the anti-Pope, Pope Giovanni XXIII, whose release from capture by the Emperor, Giovanni de' Medici, had secured and paid very dearly for, and whom Giovanni had sheltered in his home in Florence. When he died in 1419, Giovanni de' Medici commissioned this tomb from Donatello and Michelozzo in the baptistry of Florence. One of the first great Renaissance sculptural tombs, 1419, even before any real sign of the Renaissance in painting. Giovanni himself died 10 years later, leaving a vast fortune and the respect of the city to his sons Lorenzo and Cosimo. The 2 sons that I've told you already founded the 2 branches of the dynasty, one branch taking over from the other at the beginning of the next century. For in the 1400s, the era of Cosimo and his descendants, which is called the principal branch of the Medici, in the 1500s, the era of Lorenzo's descendants, referred to as the cadet branch. Another glance at the family tree will show you what I mean and where we're going. Okay? So our next port of call, so to speak, is Cosimo. Is Cosimo the Il Vecchio, Cosimo the Elder. These 2 portraits from a medal show us one of the classic arts that the Medici will always be represented by, because they are like victory medals, medallions. You know, Olympic medals are just like this today, because the whole tradition comes from the medallion of ancient Greece, which is a victory symbol. So almost every Medici from this time on, and he's the second, so to speak, has these medallions made for them. And of course, they become as well much wider spread, that every hero, in a sense, in whatever discipline, people make these profile medallions, and they become collector's items, as well as works of art. Lorenzo de' Medici, I might not mention this when we speak of him, but Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, he had a medal maker resident in his household, a man who made medals like this, commemorating events and people. Events like, for example, the great ecumenical conference that took place in Florence. Cosimo il Vecchio, said somebody, first succeeded in solving the strange problem of becoming absolute ruler of a republic, keenly jealous of its liberty, without holding any fixed office without suppressing any previous form of government, and always preserving the appearance and demeanor of a private citizen. How then was such power achieved? Hollingsworth, who's on your bibliography, tells us, from 1434, she writes, why 1434? Because Cosimo de' Medici's party lost the election, so to speak. That's the easy way to explain what happened. Lost the election in 1433. And the party that came in to power exiled him, simply out of fear of the power that this man had gained, the power and prestige and wealth that he had gained by this stage. Well, Cosimo and his family trotted off to Venice, which is a very nice place to be in exile, and they waited. They just waited without doing anything. And a year later, by popular demand in Florence, they were recalled. The Medici returned. So that's why she says from 1434. From 1434, she writes, the city was governed by an elite of Medici supporters, members of the various branches of the family, men related to the family by marriage, partners in the Medici Bank, and families who owed their wealth and position to judicious support of the Medici during their rise to power. At the top of this network, Cosimo and Lorenzo were, in effect, successive heads of state. Another writer, Marcello Fantoni, says, Cosimo developed the strategy of spending money in such a way that wealth would be transferred into prestige and power. That strategy, I believe, is patronage, philanthropy, and what we now call sponsorship. On patronage as a political strategy, Hollingworth again writes of Venice, for example, that it's difficult to overemphasize the importance of art as state propaganda. Like the Florentines, the Venetians attached enormous importance to the appearance of their city, with a long tradition of exploiting the value of art and architecture as a vehicle of propaganda. They realized its vital role in the promotion of an image of power, wealth, and prestige. Those, of course, are precisely the qualities associated with the Medici. This portrait by Pontormo of Cosimo in a very humble pose was commissioned by a member of the cadet branch of the family 70 years after the death of Cosimo, one Otto Viano, who was, again, Gonfalonier of Justice in 1531, in the last Republican government. He was then, at that time, he was greatly devoted to Cosimo I, Grand Duke, which is, in a sense, why he commissioned this painting from the great Pontormo. Just as a little side, to give you some idea also of how vast these Medicis were, the son of Ottaviano, Alessandro, his name was, he became briefly Pope Leo XI. And by briefly, I mean briefly, 27 days in April in 1605. In his autobiography, Cellini, by the way, says what an awful man Ottaviano was, calling him arrogant and cantankerous. Nevertheless, one takes Cellini with a pinch of salt on anything that lacks further evidence. This portrait, on the other hand, was not commissioned by a Medici, and it comes from Botticelli's famous Adoration, painted about 1475. That's a very tricky date of this painting anyway, because of various internal evidences. However, it was therefore an accurate portrait of Cosimo il Vecchio, because Botticelli knew him, of course. It was painted for a chapel in the church of Santa Maria Novella and commissioned by a certain Gaspare Lama, also a Florentine banker. It had a very interesting history, and it ended up 1 century later in the Medici collections, confiscated by the Grand Duke Francesco from the property of another poor fellow who got in the way and was exiled for treason. Cosimo's passions were primarily building and books. Although he commissioned also sculpture, as we know from his love of Donatello, and he commissioned painting. In this painting, from the stories of Medici in the Palazzo Vecchio, another commission, an act of patronage from a century after him, commissioned by his namesake, the Grand Duke, we see Brunelleschi presenting to Cosimo a model of San Lorenzo, the church of San Lorenzo, and Cosimo, as you can see, is saying, yes, that's very pretty, now go and build it over there. Notice, by the way, this and this, because we'll come across them again. A falcon with a diamond ring. The Basilica of San Lorenzo is, of course, one of the great monuments of Florence, not only for its construction by Brunelleschi, but for the many extraordinary things inside, works by Donatello, Verrocchio, Bronzino, and later additions by Michelangelo, and the library and the cloisters. All of them Medici commissions, because the Medici practically, well, they did, in fact, own this church. They wouldn't have said so, but of course it was in their back garden, and they virtually owned the church. It's not the only church, however, that was endowed to a huge extent. The other one was San Marco. From Donatello, Cosimo himself commissioned the unusual 2 pulpits, bronze pulpits in this church, the Resurrection pulpit and the Passion pulpit. Each pulpit is made of bronze and marble, standing today on 4 marble columns. They were mounted on the columns probably in the 16th century. And there's much debate about the individual panels, the location and the artist's intention. Not much is clear about these, because there's very little documentation at this stage. They were perhaps Donatello's last masterpieces. They were done in 1465, and he died in the following year. We'd wonder how much of them the commissioner, i.e. Cosimo il Vecchio, actually saw, because he had died in 1464. What is certain about them is that they are the most extraordinary and wonderful works of art and skill. This is the scene of the Martyrdom of San Lorenzo, in which we witness Donatello's breathtaking command of perspective in a shallow space. I'm sure that you can imagine the depth looking at that roof and the ceiling and even the figures, particularly that one on the left, on the corner of the building, what depth there is. In fact, that whole panel is only about 5 centimeters wide. If you hurry, you can see it and the others on this pulpit right in front of your nose, because the pulpits are presently being restored and you can climb onto the scaffolding for a mere €1, which I did last Saturday. Cosimo's more private commissions from Donatello included probably 2 statues for the garden and courtyard of Palazzo Vecchio. Of those biblical heroes, one now stands outside the Palazzo Signoria, that's the Judith and Holofernes. Again, Donatello is simply stunning in his skill and his composition. This is not a work that is greatly to my liking, but it is to be hugely admired. The other one, probably more famous, is now in the National Museum of Sculpture in the Bargello, much admired, studied, and disputed. It's a matter of interest. You see behind it another of Donatello's works, the marble St. George, another fellow that looked upon makes you shudder in admiration. This David, however, was the first freestanding bronze nude statue produced since antiquity. So it's a very important piece of art history, as well as a very beautiful piece of work. Although there's no real documentation of its commission by Cosimo, it was first noted in the Medici Palace garden during his lifetime. Now here's a table I've put in to help illustrate the extent of Cosimo's patronage of buildings, because I clearly can't show you every one or say more than a sentence about them. The church and convent of San Marco was a very big project, one into which he poured enormous resources, hiring the architect, his favorite architect, Michelozzo, to build the church, the cloisters, the library, and Fra Angelico and Benozzo to do the frescoes, which I hope you've all seen. The church and convent of San Lorenzo, I've already mentioned, was like his own house, and was 50 meters from his own house. And there he employed Brunelleschi and Donatello principally, but lots of others. The David and the Judith I've mentioned, we've seen. The Palazzo Medici Riccardi, that was built for him by Michelozzo. Apparently, the story is that he turned down Brunelleschi's design as being too grand. Cosimo himself is mentioned by everybody as being a very humble man. The beauteous thing that remains in there are the frescoes by Benozzo, and we have here a contemporary quote that the interior of the house by the 3 generations, ending with Lorenzo, was surrounded, overloaded with splendor, of a wealth that, although not flaunted, but on the contrary half concealed, is so lavish as to be almost cumbersome. He built the country, he didn't build, but he had altered the country villa at Careggi. You see in the remarks column there where Cosimo created his Platonic Academy. Ha ha, no he didn't. church and convent of Santa Croce, the dormitories there, which are still not public area, but two enormous cloisters there. The church and convent of Santissima Annunziata. That church of Santissima Annunziata has always been one of the favorites of the Medici, and we'll see something about it later. The Badia at Fiesole is less well known, and I'll mention that in a moment. And then painting the Entombment, we'll come in a moment also to that. But there's an interesting remark there from a contemporary that he spent 70,000 gold florins on the architecture of the Badia and about 14,000 on the decoration. So that's about 140 years of being a teacher. This is Careggi, the villa at Careggi, bought by Cosimo's father, Giovanni de' Bici, in 1417. And on the death of Giovanni, Cosimo commissioned Michelozzo to renovate the property extensively. It was his favorite villa, and he died there, and Lorenzo de' Medici was born there, and Lorenzo died there, and one reads everywhere that he established a Platonic academy there. This, unfortunately, is one of those foundation myths based on an incorrect reading of just two documents, two contemporary letters. And it was completely disproved in the 1990s. Yet every book, every article continues to repeat the old chestnut of the Platonic academy established by Cosimo at Careggi. The villa at present is part of the University Hospital, and I've been unable to establish exactly who owns it. But it's closed and being renovated and will be open to the public in 2020. The last one on the list is the Badia at Fiesole, with which you're less familiar, I'm sure. But I show it to you because Cosimo was himself so knowledgeable about building that he was apparently the architect of this church as well. You know, architect not in the sense of an architect today, of course, but at the Badia at Fiesole, it's recorded that there's no name recorded with the design and building of this, except Cosimo, who it's recorded as being there every day while it was constructed. So we take it to be absolutely his creation. And it's here in a private ceremony in this church, this monastery, quite a little way out of Florence, so a little more secret in a sense, that Cosimo's great-grandson, Giovanni, would be invested with his cardinalate at the age of 16. And that was the man who became Pope Leo X. I choose to show you these two also because I want to make the point again that the Medici heritage survives today. The Badia at Fiesole is today the seat of the very prestigious European University Institute, the EUI, as we call it, a very high-powered institute for advanced studies in the humanities established by a European Union. And quickly to painting. Of course, there were many commissions by Cosimo for various churches, but I want to mention two special paintings. This one, which is by Roger van der Weyden, painting of the Entombment of Christ. I would rather, it's the Entombment, was hanging in the Medici villa at Careggi that we've just seen. That it was the commission of Cosimo seems to be confirmed by the presence, by its private location within his villa, and the fact that the figure of Nicodemus, looking straight at us, dressed in expensive clothing, has been identified as a portrait of Cosimo. The work follows the Entombment of Christ by Fra Angelico in the predella of the altarpiece of San Marco, painted around 1440. And that altarpiece itself was an important commission from the Medici. Fra Angelico's